Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening even, depending where you are in the world. This is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of DevOps.com, and welcome to another DevOps webinar. Today's webinar is a little bit different than a lot of the ones that we do in the normal course of our webinars, in that this is a video webinar, if you couldn't tell by the two folks and video screens in front of you. We won't be doing sort of the regular slide, dog, and pony show. It's going to be more of an interactive chat, and we've tried this format a few times now. It's been very successful, but what we really like about it, though, what really makes it go, is if we get some great audience participation. So how can you participate? Well, we can do some, polling questions and such, but I don't know how much of that we'll be doing today. But what we'd really like you to do is utilize the questions part or section of our GoToWebinar control panel. For most of you, the control panel will be in the upper right-hand corner, and if you expand that section that's more questions, you can see you can type in your question. We may not get to your question this moment, but once it's in there, it's queued, and we can get to it when we can. So, with that being said, let us talk about today's webinar. So, today's webinar. Well, first of all, let me introduce our guest. Smiling gentleman here with the earbuds is Kieran Taylor of CA. Kieran, welcome.
Thanks very much, Alan. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Glad you can have us here. And Kieran, I'm terrible with titles, but can you just let our audience know what your position is?
Absolutely. So I'm a Senior Director at CA Technologies. I'm responsible for our DevOps Solutions Marketing, which, if you're familiar with CA's extensive portfolio, we've got a number of different solutions that run across the software delivery lifecycle, really aimed at automating everything from testing to performance monitoring and ultimately guaranteeing the overall quality of your application so that when you serve your users and your customers, it's a flawless experience. So I have a responsibility to kind of pull together those different products into a singular DevOps go-to-market, and then in addition, also oversee our IT operations monitoring products. So you can think of solutions like application performance management, infrastructure monitoring, and network monitoring. That's a secondary area of ownership for me at CA Technologies.
Sure. And Kieran, I would just like to add into the mix, part of this CA technology portfolio that you guys have amassed and developed is also the security kind of within that DevOps continuum, if you will, with the recent acquisition of Veracode and so forth. It is a end-to-end CA's portfolio in this space now between Rally and Agile and the testing with BlazeMeter, and it's end-to-end. I mean, soup to nuts within that DevOps sort of mindset. That being said, though, Kieran, and to our audience out there, what we're going to focus in on today is implementing a best practices approach to container monitoring. And frankly, Kieran, container monitoring is something that hasn't gotten its fair share of attention. We've been so focused on how do you set up this container infrastructure? How do you implement, right, the application? Just getting the applications up and running in a production environment. We really haven't seen a lot of focus on, okay, now that it's up, how do we monitor it? How do we constantly improve it? How do we make sure it's performing? What happens post-deployment? And this is an area that, if you think about it, getting the application up is only the first step. Maintaining it, monitoring it is kind of the whole life cycle piece of it. So, want to talk about containers, but Kieran, so first of all, you and I have been in IT a long time. I'm assuming most of our audience out there is somewhat familiar with containers, but what does this whole kind of container move to containers kind of mean to you, Kieran?
Well, as you just mentioned, Alan, we're seeing that the first motion around container-based applications and the microservices that run into them, the first motion that we see is, yes, just how do I stand up the applications? How do I get my apps running in this new distributed environment? And the management of that is a secondary consideration. And back to DevOps, it's a little bit, if we think of DevOps as people, process, and technology, the people involved in DevOps, the ones that are innovating most quickly are not traditional operations people, right? And so when we look at the ops side of DevOps, that's a culture of stability, somewhat risk adverse. They've traditionally lived in a world where resources were very well organized, systematically constructed, and with containers and microservice architectures, because they simplify that development process, we're seeing that it's developers that are embracing these technologies for time to market and innovation reasons, but in process, they're kind of skipping over some of the best practices that an operations team would advise around monitoring. And you can't manage what you can't measure, and so we would say that DevOps is a perfect occasion around containers and these distributed apps for the two teams, Dev and Ops, to come together and really determine how they can take a new approach to monitoring these apps in a distributed environment.
Sure. So, Kieran, you said the magic words. That means you got to do a shot. Microservices. So, whenever I hear people talk about containers and microservices, Kieran, I'm reminded of something I learned in grammar school, which is all macaroni is pasta, but all pasta is not macaroni. And this was profound for me in about 5th or 6th grade. But, and I apologize, we have our 11:20 or whatever it is train going by here in the office. But the same is true for microservices and containers. They're not one and the same. And though they seem to go together like chocolate and peanut butter, you could have microservices without containers, certainly. And the question is, can you have containers without microservices? Right? You could have microservices without containers. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, because I do agree that I'm sure the bulk of the folks on the call today understand the difference between the two. But we still hear this a lot. A lot of our customers and folks we encounter in the marketplace equate them as being one and the same. And what ends up happening, if you don't distinguish between the two, you can end up in a position where you say, hey, monitoring containers is sufficient. As long as I can see the container health, that will be a proxy for how the application's running. And so when you're devising a strategy to manage distributed apps in these environments, you need to think about them separately, because each demands a different approach to monitoring. So container, as the name indicates, is about encapsulation. How do you encapsulate these pieces of application code? Containers don't have an underlying operating system. They share a kernel. And that matters because that means there's a lot of API calls to those OS resources, and that can make them very chatty. So when you think about monitoring, okay, we need to think about how we monitor those API calls. They can run anywhere. So containers, unlike the static world that some operations folks have lived in, we don't know when and where those containers might be spun up, and so that presents some monitoring challenges. Now, if that's containers, just the encapsulation of the code. The microservices are the apps that run within the container, and you can think of them as having a very singular purpose. It could be a store locator app, or it could be inventory lookup. Although they're often housed in containers, as you said, Alan, they can also be run in a fully provisioned VM. So microservices don't have to be in a container, but that's where we most often see them. But they could truly run on a VM or elsewhere.
Sure. And And the other, I've spoken to people about this throughout the industry, and I think what we need to remember is microservices, and the idea behind it, the ideals behind it, probably have been around for a well, containers themselves have been around, right? Way before there was something called Docker or anything like that. Linux containers are not a new phenomenon, but microservices are not, a child of containers either. They've been around a long time. But like everything else in technology, Karen, sometimes or oftentimes it's not revolutionary, it's evolutionary. So the idea of taking these containers with microservices, the strength of having them together, really, it's a game changer, right? And I think it can be a game changer that way. But let me ask you, you're the expert. CA is dealing with, I don't know what it is, 99% of the Fortune 500, or certainly a lot of customers. Within that market or within CA's customer base, how far along are we with the adoption of containers and microservices?
It's a great question, and you're right. It's not revolutionary; it's evolutionary. In the early 2000s, this would have been called SOA, or service-oriented architecture. Back then, we would have said, okay, the apps are loosely coupled. Now with microservices, they're truly decoupled. But to answer your question, I guess if we were having this call in 2016, we would have been talking more about the internet natives, maybe some small to medium-sized businesses that were, a bit more the early innovators, the very beginning of Geoffrey Moore's crossing the chasm diagram, those early adopters. Now as we head into 2018, Alan, it seems that all of our kind of traditional, mainline enterprises, financial services, banking, insurance, even healthcare, they're moving past that initial experimentation phase to really using the technologies in production. Someone on my team ran a survey just recently, and we asked them that very question, are you using microservices, container-based microservice applications in production? And the responses we got back, 41% said they are doing it today. 32% said they'd be doing it in the next 6 months. And then 16% were evaluating options, and then the remaining 11 were just in the discovery phase. So let me restate that. That's like 73% of CA's customer base that's looking at or using microservice-based applications now or in the next 6 months. So we've moved past experimentation. This is more than kind of the early adopter phase. We're seeing it go mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, Kieran, I've seen similar numbers in other surveys actually, and the first time I started seeing those numbers was, as you said, 2016. We did several surveys on this, and we found actual containers in production in the 10 to 20% category. And then a year later, that jumped, as you said, to near 40%, 50% of organizations. And the only thing that I can compare it to, Kieran, or that I use as sort of the yardstick, is what I remember of the VMware adoption, hypervisor adoption kind of path. And I thought that was incredibly rapid, how we moved, everyone sort of adopted sort of hypervisors and virtualization as a means, for infrastructure and everything else. But if we use that as a yardstick, microservices, container-based microservices seems to be accelerated even faster than VMware and hypervisors were.
I agree. Yeah, it's the technology itself enables that more rapid adoption, I think, and that might be an underlying reason why we're seeing the ramp more quickly than we did with VMs.
I mean, so those are the facts, right? Now let's, the analysis of it, Karen, is what does that mean for people listening? What does it mean for the IT sector as a whole? What does it mean for, hosting infrastructures for these things, right? I mean, the public cloud is very much a child of hypervisors and virtualization. What is containerization going to mean for that? Will we see a pendulum where, you know what, I'll host my containers on bare metal. We're seeing people do that. Host my containers on bare metal. I could do it back at my own place or at a third-party data center. I don't necessarily need public cloud, but certainly we look at Google or Microsoft or Amazon. They're embracing containers. CA is out here, right, with a full support of it. What do you think it means? What can our listeners or viewers look forward to?
Sure. Well, as you said, it's never an instance where technology is completely replaced by another technology. Everything's additive, and so evolutionary is exactly the right word. If we look at the containerized apps and maybe the challenges that they bring for IT operations, I really think there's two. One is just the ephemeral nature of containers. They spin up, they spin down, and by design, they're meant to sail fast. So it's meant to be a self-healing situation, which again is very different for monitoring, where we kind of know where the application's hosted and we know what its performance characteristics should be, et cetera. So that's one, just the ephemeral nature of the containers themselves. But then within those containers, the microservices are extremely varied, right? So where we've become used to a situation where the apps are again in a predicted place and then have a kind of predicted set of characteristics. This is completely different. They can spin up and down anywhere. They're ephemeral, and then what's inside them can vary widely as well. And so that's a challenge for IT operations teams that are perhaps used to a more monolithic type of architecture where it's highly predictable.
Sure. And you talk about monolithic and tearing them up and down. It's sort of this concept of immutable infrastructure. And I've had this conversation, it was at DockerCon, maybe in back in Austin. And I spoke to several large enterprises, and I asked them, do you patch your containers? Or do you just, tear those down and turn and spin up new ones? I mean, because it is, from an ops point of view, think about that. I don't have to worry about fixing that one. Screw it. I'll just, excuse my language, but I'll just spin up a new one and not worry about, fixing it. I'll spin it up bigger and better and faster as a new one. And that's it's an interesting position. I don't know if we've ever been in before, truly, to have immutable infrastructure like that.
But it's good that you mentioned that. One of the analogies we use when we're describing this new world order to some of our prospects, you look at the monolithic apps almost as a wedding cake, right? Mm-hmm. So think about a wedding cake. The creation of the cake is planned, weeks, if not months in advance. Each layer is baked precisely with careful thought. You overbuild the cake because you don't know, how many people are going to eat the cake, so it's overbuilt. And the serving of the cake is highly orchestrated. I mean, there's a ceremony around it, and you know precisely when and where you're going to serve that cake, and everybody gets the same flavor cake at that perfectly ordained time. But this world of microservices, if monolithic apps are that wedding cake that are served at the reception, these non-coupled microservices are more like cupcakes at a kid's birthday. Each cupcake's delivered in its own container. The cake flavors vary widely. I can put different icing on all the cakes, and I can distribute them around the room. The kids run around and grab a cake whenever they want. You don't, kind of orchestrate when they're going to be delivered. That distribution, the fact that the cupcakes are eaten on demand, I think it's a perfect analogy for how different microservice-based applications are.
That's probably the best analogy I've ever heard, Kieran. I'm going to steal that from you if it's okay. But so let's bring this home now. What does that mean from an ops point of view? It's a lot easier, especially when we, as you mentioned earlier, in the ops world, between ITSM and IDLE and all of these things, we are very used to a highly regulated, structured, I know what tomorrow brings kind of thing, right, and what we're going to do. And now we're in the world of cupcakes. And every cupcake's different. And what's an op team to do in terms, how do you monitor that? How do you deal with it?
Yeah, the questions we get most typically are, how many containers are running in my environment? How many containers do I have per host? How many per image? Are they running correctly or not? Are they ultimately helping or impeding the overall application quality of service? Those are some of the questions we get. And the traditional tools that you might use, like a topology map, right, to discover what your app topology looks like, they don't work well in the world of containers because, as I said, they're very ephemeral. The containers are being spun up and spun down. The API connections between all of these containers are numerous, and as I said, they're really, really chatty. So I'll give you an example. I was on a customer call recently, and they had, up on the wall, they had their app map hanging up there, and they were very proud of it. They were like, "Hey, look at this. We've got all of our apps, including the container-based microservice apps, displayed on this wall," and it looked like a hairball. It was just hugely complex, and we looked at it and we said, well, that's great, but what kind of learning can you take from that? It's very difficult to have this overall view of your app infrastructure when so much of it's varied and there's so much going on. So I'll use another analogy. Since you like the cupcake analogy, we'll make it another food-based analogy. Let's
That's always worked for me.
All right. So if you ever go into the advanced settings of Google Maps, you can load up a bunch of different filters on Google Maps. You can say display post offices, show me churches, show me libraries. I mean, there's a range of options there. When you fully load up all those options in Google Maps, you're presented with, like that app map example, a view of everything at once, but you don't have the ability to really learn anything when you see everything at once. And what we would advise, especially in a world of containers and microservices, is that you need an intelligent filter on top of your infrastructure. So using that Google Maps analogy, I don't care about all those other items. I just want to see the Mexican restaurants that are near me. And I click that filter, and now I've got a view that makes sense and is relevant to me. Well, this is exactly how monitoring needs to evolve. We, in our products at CA, provide a feature in what we call APM Team Center called Perspectives, and it does just that. It allows you to apply these filters, so now I've got a view that's relevant to the developer, or a view that's relevant to the network manager, or perhaps it's a task-based view. I know that I just need to see how that last deploy or a specific image is running at this point in time. That intelligent filtering, I think, is mandatory for success in monitoring microservice-based applications.
Sure. Kieran, I want to quickly put in, we've got an audience question from Robert, and he wants to know specifically about performance monitoring around this container, it's called container-based microservices architecture. That's a mouthful, but the problem is, as Robert sees it, is that microservices were written assuming a certain load, and that load can then increase dramatically over time, but the microservice wasn't necessarily built to scale, and that kind of runs counter, right, to what we know about cloud with elasticity, and even with containers, we could scale up the amount of containers, right, which theoretically can give us more capacity. But if the underlying microservice wasn't built to accommodate that, you're in a heap of trouble. Have you run in or have you seen these type of situations?
Yeah, it's maybe as a preamble to my answer, monitoring itself isn't very interesting, right? And as you said in your opening comments, it can end up being an afterthought. So while monitoring is not of interest to all, continuous improvement is of interest to all. And one of the things that we've seen, and this builds to the answer to Robert's question, is that in a DevOps scenario, you can automate your monitoring practices. You could look at how, rather than doing monitoring as friction or an additional step before deployment, look at how you can approach monitoring in a shift-left way and kind of build it in at the inception of the application. Now, to Robert's question, when you do that, I think you need to look at those microservice-based apps and set them into different tiers. We think of them as altitudes, so high altitude, medium altitude, low altitude. Some of the container-based apps might have 100, 200 lines of code. Putting an agent on top of that container and monitoring that microservice transaction may not make sense. That might be too much overhead. So what we would advise, to Robert's question, is take a tiered approach to how these apps run, and then you might decide at the high altitude, I'm going to use agentless monitoring. I'll look at the APIs and the logs that come out, but I'm not going to instrument, each and every container. I'm not going to monitor the microservices themselves. And so that might be your kind of high-level approach. High altitude, I'm going to do agentless monitoring. If we step down a layer, medium altitude, there's a class of apps that might be warranted to monitor the container health itself, but that's sufficient. I'm just going to look at the container health itself. And then at the lowest altitude, where I've got those apps that are highly critical or perhaps a bit more complex than the others, there you want the full transaction analysis, and you would use bytecode instrumentation like a traditional APM agent at the lowest altitude, so that you're actually monitoring the microservice itself, and at that transaction level, you're seeing how it's performing.
Got it. So you mentioned something that, and Robert has a follow-on question we'll get to in a second, but you mentioned something, agentless monitoring. And this brings up another issue, Karen, that it's easy to get, in my experience talking to people who are deploying containers, I call it container sprawl, right? No one deploys one container. No one even just deploys a dozen containers. Containers get deployed by the dozens, by the hundreds oftentimes, and you can quickly wind up with a container farm, that's dispersed throughout the world. Do you need to monitor every container? You certainly, like you mentioned, there are some containers that really just can't afford the overhead of an agent on there. From an ops point of view, that's enough to drive me to drink. I mean, an ops guy, how can I monitor? I need to monitor everything. So what's the answer there?
Yeah, I think that you need to take a tiered approach to what level of visibility you need for these different apps, right? And to your point, there are going to be some apps that are perhaps not critical, or they're not sophisticated to a degree where you need that transaction level analysis. So I don't know if it's a commerce transaction, that might be different than, say, I don't know, looking up a store locator app, right? Where store locator app, okay, I can rely on some synthetic monitoring. I'll make sure that the app is available, but I'm not, because it's not very sophisticated. It's a quick lookup. I don't need sophisticated analysis for that simple of a microservice. But if the microservice is responsible for, I don't know, the shopping cart function, or a execution that's business critical, well, yeah, I'm definitely going to want to monitor at the transaction level. So I think that from a system architecture or app architecture standpoint, you need to be thinking about the different characteristics of these apps, and then placing them into high, medium, or low altitude tiers, which would then dictate a different monitoring approach for each.
Makes sense to me. So Karen, let me follow up with Robert's follow-up on that. And what Robert has specifically seen is that where microservices is the bottleneck. And in one case, for instance, something as simple as having an audit trail, right? It became a major bottleneck to scaling in the instance he's talking about. Any advice or help?
a good point, and we have run into that, particularly with some of the open source approaches to monitoring. Whether Docker itself at the container level will give you some ways to, through command line, get to some basic information, but perhaps this is what Robert's mentioning, that feature in Docker doesn't actually allow you to easily store that information or have it retained on an ongoing basis, that you can use it, as Robert said, in an audit scenario, or maybe to observe some trends. So that's a key point, and it's a good one to log. Even if, no pun intended, even if you're running at that high altitude, how are you capturing the logs? How are you storing them? What sort of tools do you have to perform analytics on top of the logs? And then, in the case of that audit scenario that Robert mentions, when necessary, you've got the ability to provide that trail, if you will, as necessary. So not all solutions do that, and it's a good thing to be on the lookout for.
Sure. So, Chris, one more question, and then I have some other topics I want to hit with you. But it goes back to your cake and cupcakes, analogy before. It almost seems like the very nature of containers is not disorganized, but maybe decentralized is a good word. But it goes against the nature of ops, right? Where everything has a place and there's a place for everything, right? And in a world of cupcakes, and every cupcake has a different frosting and all of that, it just seems they're at loggerheads. How do you bring the force here, right? How do we bring order to chaos, and what do we do?
So it's a shameless plug, but I recently wrote a book called DevOps for Digital Leaders, and in that book, I talk about the fact that, and Gene Kim and others, leaders in the industry, talk about this as well. The changes at the people, process, and technology level that need to happen. I think some of that's applicable here in that, as you said, containers, microservice-based applications that run within them can be chaotic. As we said, they're designed to be ephemeral. They are very chatty. They're very varied. The cupcake flavors are all over the place. So if you look through that structure of people, process, and technology, let's step through them. From the people standpoint, I think we're seeing that developers are becoming more operations aware, and the operations folks are becoming more development aware. A great example of this is the advent of the site reliability engineer, or SRE.
Yeah.
We certainly, Google's had those titles and LinkedIn's had those titles for some time, but we did a meetup recently here in Boston, and one of the guys stood up and said, "Hey, I'm looking to hire SREs." It's the first time I had heard that on the East Coast. So it's starting to change. We're seeing the people, the culture is changing, and so that's one thing that needs to happen. From a process standpoint, the second area, I think that we need to see operations part of stand-ups, part of Scrum teams. They shouldn't be looking at development as kind of a foreign entity or foreign country. They need to be part of that as well. And then the third piece would be technology. And we talked about it briefly with that Google Maps example, but you're right. With the cupcakes being so varied and so different, you need a new semantics-based approach to how you handle monitoring. And what do I mean by that? Well, you can, beyond just kind of host names, how are you classifying the different aspects of how these apps run? How are you able to, apply metadata, again, the semantics-based view, so that I can have role and task-based filters applied to make sense out of the chaos? And I think that's, one of the changes that needs to happen from a technology standpoint. So, people, process, and technology changes in all three areas, but I think it's helpful for organizations to pull that apart and think, okay, what am I doing culturally? What am I doing from a process standpoint? And then, okay, what monitoring technology am I using? And to wrap that all up, okay, let's say I check all three boxes. Ultimately, Alan, that should result in shift left monitoring, where monitoring is not now just operations job. It's something that is thought about at the outset of the application. It's very inception, whether it's the developer or the operations gal that's part of that Scrum team, they're thinking about monitoring from the outset, and it's not an afterthought.
I heard someone said something to me the other day. It was actually a podcast I did. They said shift ops left, but shift dev right. To kind of bring that DevOps kind of thing together. But Kieran, we're running towards the end of our podcast here. For those listening, and if you don't have it handy right now, perhaps we can get it to them. Everyone who's here is registered, I assume, and we have their email. What would you give them? Give us Kieran's top tips for best practices in container monitoring. Whether it be 3, 5, I don't care. What would you say are the top things that people should really kind of focus in on here?
Sure. I would say that number one, distinguish between the container and the microservice that may be running in it. So, don't think that monitoring container health alone is sufficient. Think about those microservices that are running in it, and as we mentioned, take a tiered approach to how you might apply monitoring to them. Number two, I'd be paying attention to the API communications between the containers and thinking about whether you've got visibility into how those calls are made, whether they're being responded to, whether they're being triggered appropriately. You have full visibility into the API transaction itself. Another thing that kind of gets lost in all of this is the network. Ultimately, as sexy as the code is and all the innovation around these new apps, it's still the network that delivers everything. And it's funny, we've come to expect that the network is always there, but quite often that foundation can determine whether the microservice is executed correctly or not. And so the third best practice I'd leave you with is when you think about monitoring, look at monitoring that covers not just the app layer, but literally, if we think about the OSI stack, down from presentation to physical, can I see app, infrastructure, and network in my approach to monitoring? Quite often we see that you may be monitoring just at the app layer, so to speak, and you've forgotten about the infrastructure or the network. And now you've got these blind spots that can quite often be the Achilles heel of the application. So those are the three best practices I'd leave you with, Alan.
Fantastic. I think that's a great takeaway for people. Kieran, I'm going to ask our audience if they have any questions to type them in here so we can get to it. But while we're giving people a moment to do that, I wanted to just also, again, shameless plug, but we've got CA World coming up. Was it November 14th to the 17th, something like, right?
That's right. Yeah, you got it.
It's out at Mandalay Bay in Vegas, and very shameless plug. I'm hosting a panel on continuous testing that I'm kind of excited about. But what else? I mean, in the area of container monitoring and containers, microservices, what can people maybe find out at CA World on this?
So we've got a number of sessions at CA World that are dedicated to this very topic that we discussed today, and folks that are more knowledgeable and more technical than myself are really going to get into everything from hands-on lab type workshops to some technical discussions with our customers in a panel type setting. So if you Google CA World 17, you'll be directed to a site where we've got a show guide, and in that show guide is a breakout of what we're doing specific to microservices-based monitoring, and you'll see a number of sessions there that I think are that I must see, as well as your continuous testing session, Alan, because I'm looking forward to that as well.
Okay. Kieran, we have a question here, though. This person says, I run a Rancher for my containers. I don't know if he's referring to Rancher OS, but he runs a Rancher for my containers. Any suggestions on which tool or technique I can use to monitor and aggregate them all?
So I don't have kind of an answer that's specific to Rancher OS. I'd say that, you know, in general, you need to be looking at, number one, how do you instrument the apps in that scenario, and how do you quickly collect, aggregate, store that information. Shameless plug, you know, with CA application performance management, we've got proven examples of how we can quickly collect, aggregate, and store that data, and then powerful analytics engine atop all of it to make sense of it. So I don't have anything specific to Rancher, but I could take that as a follow-up item, Alan.
Fantastic. Christian, Kieran, I'm sorry, not Christian. Kieran, I don't see any other questions from the audience, though wait, we do have one here. No, not really a question. I don't see any other questions from audience. I do want to mention one thing to those listening or maybe watching this on recording. We are running the DevOps Dozen contest again this year to recognize the best in DevOps from both vendors, practitioners, technologies, books, articles, everything else. And if you like what CA's done here, maybe you want to nominate them for a DevOps Dozen Award, or nominate whoever you'd like for a DevOps Dozen Award. You can go to DevOpsDozen.com, and it's open for another 10 days or so nominations, and we'll go to finalists from there. And we do have, oh, looks like we got another one. We do have one more question, Karen, if you don't mind. Which monitoring solution or tools do you recommend for monitoring microservices that can cover both aspects of the app layer and network layer monitoring? Great
question. So we recently introduced a solution called Digital Experience Insights. If you go to ca.com/try DXI, TRY-DXI, there's a free trial of the solution there. And it's built to do just that, Alan. It's meant to monitor at both app and infra layers, as well as combining, you know, ultimately the user experience measurement, whether it's a web or mobile setting. So that would be our answer. Is try DXI out. It's a 30-day trial, and I think you'll find that it provides just what you need in terms of both app and infra monitoring. Fantastic. All right. So if that's it, wow, we finished a minute or two early, which is damn good. All right. Kieran Taylor, CA, thanks so much for being our guest on this webinar chat. We'll see you in just a couple of weeks at CA World. Sounds great. Thank you. And for our listeners, thanks for joining us. We hope you found this informative. The recording of it will be up on our YouTube DevOps TV channel. You can get it there. You can, of course, always write us if you have any questions, or we can pass it along to our Kieran and our friends at CA. But for now, this is it for DevOps.com's webinar today. This is Alan Schimmel of DevOps.com, and we hope to see you soon on another DevOps webinar. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye, Kieran. Thanks, everyone.